Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming for the seminar today. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to mention about Sean Ha. He got the second place in the Paul Togerson Masters Research Excellence. Let's congratulate him for that. Okay, our speaker today is Avik. Avik Sen Gupta is a PhD student in the Bradley Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. He is associated with the Hume Center for National Security and Technology. He is advised by Dr. Clancy and Dr. Ravi Tandon. He got his bachelor's in West Bengal University of Technology in 2010 and master's from Kansas State University in 2012. His research interests include wireless communications with an emphasis on content distribution and caching in wireless networks. He interned with the Advanced Technology Group at BlackBerry, where he worked on LTE system design for D2D, and the Wireless Access Lab at Huawei Technologies, where he worked on downlink resource scheduling and power control in LTE, E-Node B LTE systems. And so we have another talk on caching, so hopefully you can relate stuff from the last caching talk and ask him some interesting questions. And maybe just a question to people working on caching. I just want to know, how practical would caching be? Maybe we can go over his talk and have a small discussion at the end. Is it really possible to split files and place them in caches in a real-time scenario? Cool.
Thanks.
You don't define yourself as information theorist yet?
No. I'm just applying some techniques that are out in the open. Nothing cool. So, good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about, the title seems like pretty involved, but it's not actually. So I'm talking about an information theoretic framework for caching. These are some results that have been recently proposed to kind of improve on the currently known notion of caching in wireless networks. Not particularly wireless networks, but we can also think of it as wired backhaul networks or any sort of network in general. I'm going to be introducing some of the recent results, and then I'm going to just talk about some of the things that we have done based on these results in the security area. Like we have done some work based on secure caching and delivery. So I'll introduce some of those things. So as far as motivation is concerned, basically we have seen over in the recent times, there has been a paradigm shift in mobile wireless traffic from like mostly voice call based traffic to increasingly content centric traffic. And this is kind of also motivated by the fact that 1G and 2G networks generally were mostly circuit switched, whereas 3G, 4G, like in reality 2.5G onwards are becoming more and more packet switched, which is more conducive to data communications. Another great enabler for this kind of content-centric traffic is smartphones in modern worlds. So basically, multimedia content is the main application that is consumed by smartphones, and people are mostly looking to watch videos or things like that with their smartphones. So what has happened as a result of this transition is there has been an exponential growth in data traffic over mobile networks. And I'll again present the same sort of data that everyone talks about, Cisco's VNI index. So if we see the 5-year projection for data growth, we can see that it's mostly dominated by data consumed by smartphones. And in turn, if we look at an application-based usage, we can see that the blue one here, which is videos. So videos are going to dominate all sorts of data traffic. Essentially, the thing with videos is the kind of video that is portrayed here, it's basically classified under non-GBR or non-guaranteed bitrate traffic. The implication being the videos, the files, when they're transmitted over the air, they don't have as stringent requirements for latency as VoIP, for example. But the problem with videos is their volume. Like people tend to watch large videos on YouTube or share large video files. And as a result, the volume of this kind of traffic has the capability of creating a huge bottleneck in modern networks. So there is specifically a need to kind of increase the efficiency of these networks to deal with such large volume of traffic. Obviously, there has been several approaches. The migration to an LTE network is basically one of the main approaches that has been undertaken in the infrastructure-based approach. And even within that, many interference mitigation schemes, if you talk about infrastructure-based approaches like heterogeneous networks, or even to that extent D2D communications, which are all tuned to kind of increase network efficiency. But one thing that is missing, I won't say missing, but one thing that is not typically addressed by these sorts of approaches is the temporal nature of traffic. So when we see requests and the consumption of data over a day, we will see that there is a very temporal nature inherent to this kind of network traffic. And Another fact is in modern systems, storage is something which is really ubiquitous. So it has become cheap and compact, and it is present in almost all sorts of devices. So in your smartphone, you readily have a lot of storage available. As far as base stations are concerned, you can still have a lot of storage in them without a huge cost. So what we tend to kind of look at is to exploit this temporal nature of traffic and exploit the storage simultaneously. And this is where caching has kind of played a big role in recent times. So what we tend to do is exploit this temporal nature and see that if we can store content at times when the network traffic is very low. So what I am showing here is kind of some of the data that I collected from Abdullah, if you remember his presentation. So this is a real-time observation over a period of 1 day of the cellular band's downlink power. So this is directly correlated to the downlink activity that is going on in those bands. And if you can see, there is clearly a very temporal aspect to this traffic. For example, the highlighted areas, these are the times when the traffic is really low. And we can exploit these low network traffic times to kind of populate caches. And then when the traffic is actually high, we can deliver content in a complementary manner. So basically,
Traffic, is that all the traffic, or is that only traffic from selected subcategories such as media?
so this picture is for depiction purposes and it depicts all the traffic. But in real time, if you are thinking just about caching and multimedia, you actually would consider something like a selective kind of thing. But basically, multimedia traffic kind of dominates the volume of traffic, right? This is what I was talking about. So if the multimedia volume is low, you generally expect lower volume as a whole. So that is kind of the idea here in caching, that we perform cache placement during times of low load and utilize times of high traffic to deliver complementary content. So basically, if a part of the file is already present in your cache and you end up requesting that file, at the time of high network load, you don't need to transmit the whole file, but you can just transmit whatever is not present in your cache. Now, this raises some practical questions, obviously, that how do you figure out popular files or what file might be requested? So this is a machine learning approach which can be taken, or some sort of learning approach can figure out a set of popular files for a day. And there has been work on this particular area. For now, for the purpose of this talk, we will assume that we know that there is a set of likely files to be requested by users, and we'll call it a library of files, and we will perform our schemes on those particular files. So this is a graphic which is kind of reiterating the same point. You prefetch files and store them in the network caches for the devices. And at this point of time, when you're actually storing files, the demands for the users are unknown to the server. So when you place files, you should place in such a way that it is agnostic to the demands. It shouldn't be demand specific. And then once the requests for the users are revealed, you basically want to deliver the complementary content over the network. So for this problem, there has been a lot of research. Obviously, a lot of people have talked about caching, but one of the things that I'm going to talk about is an information theoretic setting which was introduced around 2 years back by Madda Ali and Neeson. They were researchers in Bell Labs. So they considered a simple abstraction of this caching problem. So if we consider a central server which has n files, and these n files are basically the most popular, or you can consider that notion that these files are the most popular or the most likely to be requested. And consider k users, and that each user has a specific amount of cache storage m, where m is the number of files that a user can store. So this is an abstraction, so we are considering the fact that each file is of equal size, and we will assume that each file has a size of v bits. The main purpose of this is to demonstrate the kinds of gains that you can actually get out of a caching network by intelligently designing the placement and the delivery schemes. So what you generally want to do is you want to place some function of these files in the caches, and then you want to deliver content to users. Now, in the traditional sense, caching has always worked as point-to-point delivery, in the sense that if a user has a cache memory of m files, what you want to do is you want to store some fraction of all possible files in that user's memory, and when he requests a particular file, you just deliver the complementary content. For example, if there are n files, each user can store like m by n fraction of every file in its cache. And then when it requires any file, you can just send 1 minus m by n fraction of that file over the network. So this is the notion of traditional unicast delivery. But what Madali and Neeson showed is that if you intelligently place functions so that it enables you to multicast instead of send unicast point-to-point transmissions to each user, you can actually end up doing a lot better in terms of rate.
By functions, you mean linear combinations?
Linear combinations. So I'll come about the achievable scheme, but for the general purpose, it's any function you can imagine. So linear, non-linear, it's not really limited by that, like the basic formulation. So the trade-off here, obviously there's a trade-off here. So basically, if you think about the fact that a user has a very large memory, so in that case, it can store most of the library of the files, almost all of it, and you need to send very little over the network. So the trade-off in this case would be the rate that you send over the air to the amount of storage that is available. And what we aim to look at this setting is that what is the worst case rate that can be achievable for multicast content delivery. And by worst case rate, I mean the fact that so suppose every user is requesting some file. If there is a commonality in the requests, then you can end up sending less stuff. So one delivery might actually satisfy multiple users. But consider the worst case scenario where every user requests something different. So in that case, you need to send everything. So in this case, this is the case that we are looking at essentially in this work. That what can you do to kind of minimize the rate in such a case where every user requests something different. So we will consider a simple example. Obviously, I'll just try to demonstrate the main idea through two examples here. We'll consider a simple example of two users and two files. Suppose there are two files A and B and there are two users, and each user has a cache memory of 1 unit. That is, each user can store one file at most. So assuming that, say, every file is of size 1 GB. So each user can store 1 GB in its cache memory. Now, if you think about the traditional unicast scheme, so each user can store half of the file in their caches, half of every file. So file A and file B, each user can store. So if you break up the files into two components, A1 and A2 and B1 and B2, each user can store half of these things in their caches. That is A1 and B1 and A2 and B2. And now when, suppose the worst case request is what? The worst case request would be each user requesting something different, that is A and B. In this case, for unicast, you need to send half of both files over the air, which will lead you to a rate of 1, which you can see here for M1. The achievable rate for the conventional scheme will be 1. But now you can actually do something better than just sending a rate 1 over the air. So what you can do is, instead of sending a rate 1, you can kind of, say for a demand where each user requests the same file, you can actually XOR these two parts of the files together, A1 and A2, and you can send it over the air. So at the receiving end, the user 1 has A1 in its cache, so it can XOR this out and get A2 cleanly, while user 2 has A2 in its cache and can get A1. So with these complementary components cleanly out, they are able to decode the files. So this is a better example, I guess, where the file requests are different. And this can be shown for all possible requests in this case. So you end up achieving a rate of half, which is basically quite a bit of improvement over the conventional scheme. So
Why is it better to move like this?
Huh?
Why is it good to move towards the left of the trade-off? Just
No, it's not better to move towards the left of the trade-off. So what I'm trying to show is one achievable scheme at a given point. So basically you can, so the trade-off basically, obviously you can imagine that it goes down, the rate over the air goes down as the cache memory increases, right? So for that point, this is an achievable scheme. Now, if you think about achievable schemes for any point between the points, say 2, 0, if cache memory is 0, obviously no one can store anything. You have to send both the files. Now, if you think about any point between those two, then you can actually do a linear combination of both the schemes. Time sharing, basically time sharing. So you kind of divide the files into some alpha and 1 minus alpha, and the caches also into 1 alpha and 1 minus alpha, and then you perform each of these schemes in the two parts, and you can achieve any rate on that. And similar to this thing. But this is a two-user example, so obviously there is one achievable point here that I'm showing. So let's concentrate on a slightly larger example where we can show that sharing content among caches basically leads to this improvement that I talked about. So now consider the fact that a cache memory of 2 is present in each user, and there are 3 files and 3 users. So we will divide the files as follows. We will divide each file again into 3 parts, and we will index them as 1, 2, 1, 3, and 2, 3. Now, the indexing is basically reflecting the fact that which user gets to store which fragment in the caches. So for every file, the user 1 basically stores that fragment which has its index in it. So user 1 stores A12 and A13. B stores A12 and 23, and so forth. So now if you consider, and this kind of satisfies the memory constraint as well, because you are dividing every file into 1/3 and you are storing 2/3 of those fragments. So you end up storing two whole files worth of stuff. Now, if you consider a request ABC in this case, you can see that by sharing content across caches, and again consider the unicast scheme from before. The unicast scheme from before would be to send 1/3 of the file to every user, right? So this user requests A, B, and C. You send A23, A13, and A whatever 12 to that guy. So the cumulative rate would have been 1 again in that case. But in this case, you can actually send this multicast transmission to all the users, and this one multicast transmission satisfies everyone. User 1 can decode A23 using B13 and C12 because that is already present in its cache, while user 2 can decode B13 and user C can decode C12. And this is possible for all sorts of different demands. So I just shown 2 here. So the bottom line is you actually end up gaining a lot on the rate, transmission rate. So the conventional scheme was a straight line joining these two, and then here you end up with a rate of 1/3. And obviously for the MU equal to 1 point, it's again an achievable scheme that can be shown, but this is just one example. So now if we increase the number of users and files, we can see that you actually end up gaining order-wise improvements in rate, which is pretty good in fact. And this is mainly coming from the multicast transmissions that you are able to do by intelligently sharing content among caches. So the main idea here is to couple caches together, essentially. So instead of thinking about every cache as an individual entity, you can actually couple these caches together, and you can utilize these couplings to deliver multicast content, which is useful to not only one but multiple users. So this is the achievable rate that this scheme actually gives in general. I'll talk about the general truth slightly, but this is kind of the main idea behind the scheme. So you can see that this first component is the unicast gain that I was talking about. So if you just store m by n and you transmit 1 minus m by n to each user, and there are k users, so this is the unicast gain that you can end up getting. But if you are multicasting, this is an additional gain that you get on top of the unicast gain. And this is what the advantage is in sharing content across users. So now, like I talked about in the previous slide, so there are specific points at which you can show achievable schemes. So Mardali and Neeson actually characterized it this way. So if you have a cache memory of M, you can actually write it as n by k, where n is the number of files and k is the number of users, and parameterize it by a variable t. Now, in order to look at the whole trade-off, we look at only points where t is an integer, and t is an integer from 1 to k. So these are the points that we look at achievable schemes for. And any scheme in these points are done by time sharing, basically. So now this is kind of the general proof for this achievability. I talked about 2 specific examples. If you think about the previous example that I talked about, the 3-user example with memory of 2. Yeah. Sure.
Is there any fundamental assumptions behind that theorem, like they have the same performance or the same?
Yeah. So this problem analyzes this work analyzes a problem where you consider that each user has the same size cache. So the cache content or the cache storage across all users is uniform. And also, I mean, I talked about the fact that this is an abstraction, so this is just to kind of show the gains that you can achieve by multicasting. So each file is also supposed to be of equal size in this case, so equal size of B bits. So you are splitting things of equal size and you are storing things in equal sized caches.
There is no result showing that you can do better by not dividing this resource into equal size, but 2.
So not really. Basically, if you divide it into unequal sizes, then you have to. So that then this achievable scheme does not work specifically. But if you divide it into unequal sizes, you have to come up with another achievable scheme, and there is no result that actually shows that you can do better by that. The bottleneck I would say here is the assumption that every user has the same size of storage. If you consider cases where users have different storage sizes, then your idea would be something that you would want to look at. And that is some extensions that are actually being worked on right now. So this is like a 2-year-old problem. So there are many extensions out there. I myself have worked on some. So that is one of the things. Yeah, that is one of the things that needs to be
The rate
considered.
of that would be worse than this rate, right?
So then we would come to this problem of having unequal cache sizes, and then it would be kind of limited by the average cache size or the sum cache size. So if your sum cache size is much larger, or the average cache size is the same, then the rate would be, you would expect to get a similar rate or slightly worse rate. Mostly slightly worse rate because you cannot exploit all multicasting opportunities then. So the multicast is limited by the lowest memory in the system then. And you need to find better ways of kind of exploiting all possible opportunities of multicast and unicast.
But these order results will still hold, right? I mean,
The order results will still hold.
so there is a lot of value in taking these abstracted models to
Yes.
just study what the order of scaling is.
Exactly. Because the cool part is here, as you increase number of files and users, your order optimality is like a lot better than the unicast schemes, right? So even in sizes of unequal cache size, even if you have a very small, the smallest cache is very small and the largest cache is very large. Even in that case, if you can end up utilizing some order of multicasting, you actually end up gaining a lot in terms of rate instead of unicasting to everyone.
The size has to be order 1.
Yeah.
Then
Yeah.
all the proofs will go through in terms of the order of.
Yes. So I guess the assumption is that you have at least the size of storage as a single file in your cache.
In their scheme, are they assuming that the cache size is increasing with the number of files?
Not per se. So they are looking at all possible cache sizes from the fact that you can have a zero cache to a cache of size of all the entire library. And basically they characterize points on that achievability where they show that this is the achievable scheme. And you can achieve any point between those 2 points by doing time sharing between any of those 2 schemes. So the general idea is basically this, that once you have a cache memory and you know the k and n values, you can come up with a t, which is basically, from the previous slide, we can see that t is essentially k m by n. So given a cache memory, you know the value of the t. So now with this t, what you do is you divide each file into k choose t non-overlapping subfragments. So in the previous example, t was 1. T was 2 because k equal to n. And we had like 3 subfragments or subfiles. And we divided, suppose file A, we divided it into 1, 2, 1, 3, and 2, 3. So you consider subsets of size t, and you divide the file into all possible subsets of size t, those many fragments. And user t obviously caches, a user k caches the file if his index is basically in that subset of tau, which is of size t. So given 3 users, you divide it into subsets of 2 and then look at what users are present in each subset and let the users cache the files where their indexes are present. So you can show that each user caches like a total of k minus 1 choose t minus 1 into n. So for each file they cache k minus 1 choose t minus 1, and for n this is the total number. And the size, since k choose t subfragments and each file is of size b, you can get the size of the file. So if you add these things up, you can show that it still satisfies the memory constraint that each user has m amount of storage, and these things all add up to m. So in the multicast delivery phase, basically what is happening is you consider a subset of size t plus 1. So now, again I'll go back to the previous example. We had t equal to 2. So we consider a subset of size t plus 1, that is 3. Now in this subset, basically we look at each user and see what component of its requested file is missing in its cache. So in the previous example, for user 1 had A12 and 13. It was missing A23. So we will use this fragment. Then for user 2, we will again look at the subset and see what fragment of its requested file is not present in its cache. So these lead up to the multicast transmissions. So basically you will just take the requested file of the SF user. You will choose those fragments which are not in its cache, because S minus S is basically these fragments which cannot be stored by that user. You will sort them together and you will transmit them over the air. So there are many, obviously I showed you 2 simple examples. If you extend it to a large number of users, there will be many cases where the size of this set will be smaller. Say for 10 users, you look at size of a set of size 3 maybe. And then for that particular set, for multicast transmissions. So there will be, the number of multicast transmissions essentially will be the number of subsets of size t plus 1 that you can actually form. So which is basically the crux of proving the rate result. So basically you can say that you can form k choose t plus 1 number of subsets of size t plus 1 out of which you basically, those many number of multicast transmissions you send over there. And the size of each transmission then is basically v by k choose t, and you can show the result that says that this is the multicast gain and this is the unicast gain. So they also propose a lower bound on this problem. So this is an achievable scheme, but it does not say that this is the best achievable scheme. I think that was kind of your question, that is this the best that you can do, right? It does not say anywhere that this is the best you can do, but the way they actually motivate their achievable scheme is that it is order optimal. So the way to do that is kind of come up with a lower bound and say that, okay, this is the worst you can do. And then if you can show that there is some sort of relation between this lower bound and the upper bound, which is independent of system parameters, then you are basically kind of saying that the achievable rate that I am giving is kind of optimal up to a constant gap. So which is what the main idea of this work was. So they proposed a converse or a lower bound based on information theoretic aspects. So this is based on the cut set bound. I won't go into details of the proof here. I'll just give the expression, and then when I talk about security, I can kind of talk a bit about how to come up with this expression. But just to compare, so this red curve is now the lower bound, and the blue curve is the achievable scheme. And we can see that the achievable scheme is pretty much close to the lower bound, and they actually show in their paper that the gap between the achievable and the optimal, or the achievable and the lower bound, is actually 12. It's a constant gap. So it's a very involved kind of numerical proof, but you can show that it's independent of all problem parameters and it's at most 12. So this kind of shows that even with the lower bound and the achievable scheme that they propose, it is kind of order optimal. So this is what the literature on this coded caching, this is where it started. And then there have been many extensions to realistic settings, basically. This is a very basic abstraction of the problem. And there have been, again, this is also a very basic lower bound that they proved here. There have been works to improve this lower bound, and actually we have done some work which shows that you can improve the gap as well. So now I'll just talk about some of the work that I have done. So in this case, basically we considered this problem setting in a setting where there is an eavesdropper who can actually listen over the multicast link. So basically our point is we want to achieve secure delivery in a setting of a central server multicasting to multiple users. And what we want to show is that basically the mutual information between the transmissions, so this X D1 to DK is basically a transmission, multicast transmission in response to requests D1 to DK, which is basically the file. So if in the previous case, the multicast transmission would have been labeled by XABC, for instance. And we want to show that XABC and the library of files ABC have a mutual information of 0. So this is a very strong condition, by the way. This is like an information theoretic security condition. So it does not need to be satisfied in realistic schemes, but what we aim to show is basically the absolute worst case that can happen, right? So the solution we come up with is also very simple, actually, in a sense. You just don't you just store keys in the cache, and you do a one-time patch scheme. So a one-time patch scheme is basically the case where you have orthogonal keys, like truly orthogonal keys, or truly orthogonal keys in each cache, and you can use these keys to encode the message. Now, one-time pad has a practical limitation in the case where you cannot actually reuse these keys. So for every demand, you need to rekey. But since we are looking at a worst possible security threat in this case, we are actually using a one-time pad to characterize the secure trade-off. Obviously, you can do slightly better than that in realistic cases if you relax your security constraint to not being an information theoretic security constraint.
That is because if you use the same piece over time, you will.
Yeah.
The eavesdropper can take.
So the eavesdropper can actually, you are looking at XORs, right? So the eavesdropper can actually XOR two things and get the XOR the key out if you use the same key. So I'll just talk about that example. So again, I'll go back to the simple previous example of n equal to k equal to 2. And now in this case, we'll actually have m equal to 3 by 2. So we do a similar sort of data caching as before, A1, B1, and A2 and B2. But now we have a shared key between these two users, which is this key here. And the transmissions in this case, so now you can see that this data takes up a memory of 1, and the key has to be the size of each of the subfiles. So this is a key of size half. Now, if there is a demand of A, B, say, you can actually transmit this A to B1 XOR key, and this is kind of secure from a eavesdropper. So any demand basically in this case is secure from an eavesdropper. And that line over there, the one that says conventional secure scheme, you can think of it as a unicast scheme with a key in each user. So that scheme will basically kind of send point-to-point transmissions encoded by 2 keys. So it won't be a shared key in that case, it will be key 1 and key 2. So in this case, in the secure case, we can actually show that this is the achievable rate. So if you compare it to a non-secure case, we are obviously taking a slight hit in the rate because we are introducing the key and we are transmitting secure communications over there. So we are taking a slight hit. But so in this case, one vulnerability that you can think about is the fact that there is only one key in the network, right? So if suppose this user leaves the system, that key is gone. A more interesting approach is to kind of understand the delivery schemes in detail so that you can actually have different keys in the network. And what we end up doing is kind of mimicking the caching scheme in the sense that we also store shared keys. So if you share keys across networks, or across users rather, you can end up achieving a much better rate. So this is an example in that effect. So we consider a case of n equal to k equal to 3. And now if we look at the data and key placement, so we do the similar data placement as before, but now we actually have shared keys here. So there are 3 keys in the system, key 1, 2, 1, 3, and 2, 3. And each user caches that key which has its index in it. So this guy caches these, and this guy caches 1, 2, 2, 3, and 1, 3, 2, 3. Now, in case of a worst case demand, you have A, B, C, and so there will be 3 multicast transmissions in this case. So this guy demands A, but he has only A1, so it needs A2 and A3. So from the first transmission, basically what is happening is with the key K12, with the key K12 and B1, user 1 can get A2, and similarly user 2 can get B1. Similarly, in the second transmission, this guy can get C1 and user 1 can get A3 by using their shared key. And lastly, in the final case, you can use the key K23. And with these decoded contents, you are actually getting all the files back, while it is secure from a wiretapper, obviously, because you have used 3 different keys in the 3 transmissions. You have not reused any key, that is the main constraint here. So we see that we achieve a rate of 1. So if you look at this case, this is the non-secure trade-off. And we can see that this is the secure trade-off that we are obtaining. And if you increase, with the same concept, if you increase the number of files and users, you can see that security does not really have a lot of hit in the rate. Especially, this is apparent here, that if you increase the number of files and users and use the concept of shared keys in the network rather than individual key for every user, you kind of end up getting a very close curve to the original non-secure trade-off. Yeah.
So does that mean that the more devices that you have, the more portion of memory goes on to store that key?
That depends on the actual value of the M. So it's not exactly more devices, but it's the actual value of the M compared to the devices. So it will kind of depend on M by K to some extent. Yeah. Sorry, M by N. Yeah, it will depend on M by N. So N is the number of files, and M is the cache memory that each user can have, which is basically from 0 to N. But in this case, one interesting fact that I forgot to mention is the fact that in this case, you can't actually operate with a cache memory of 0, because you need to have at least one key in every user of the size of a file, right? Because otherwise, you are sending uncoded transmission over there. So we are limited by the fact that the cache memory always has to start from 1. So in the case when cache memory is 0, there has to be a key memory of 1. So we cannot operate at this point. So this is, and this is fundamentally, obviously fundamentally infeasible. So we start from M equal to 1. So if you compare the achievable rates of the two schemes, the secure scheme and the non-secure scheme, you can see that it's pretty similar in the sense that the M by N's are basically replaced by m minus 1 by n minus 1. So if you do the math and look at the shared key memory, and you can derive an achievable rate which looks exactly like this. So again, this shows the similar flavor as Mandali's scheme in the sense that this is the unicast gain, and this is the multicast gain that is added on for the case of security in both cases. So basically replacing m by m minus 1 by n minus 1 is kind of the hit you're taking as a cost of security. And obviously, you can see that asymptotically these things are obviously equal. So you are doing a lot better in terms of rate as number of users and files increase. So now that we have talked about the basic scheme, we would like to highlight some points as far as key memory and data memory is concerned. So for the scheme that we use, we can see that the data memory that you have in each device is basically equal to m minus 1 by n minus 1. This is equivalent to saying that you let every device cache m minus 1 by n minus 1 fragment of every file. And the remaining cache memory, yeah.
We assume that the keys have to be perfectly orthogonal, right?
Yes.
Does that add some vulnerability to the system because the number of orthogonal sequences that you can, completely orthogonal sequences you can come up with are much smaller than just number of pseudo-random sequences for any length and
Yes, so in that case, basically what will happen is if you use pseudo-random sequences, then the hit that you are taking is it's not zero, the mutual information, it's not zero, but it's some epsilon.
Exactly.
So if you have some threshold on that epsilon, you can actually relax that constraint. So which is what you think of in terms of cryptography actually. So you have some sort of epsilon which is non-zero, but you can achieve with a key length which is smaller than, or you can achieve with more sequences which are almost orthogonal or
so in this
pseudo-random.
perfectly orthogonal case, the number of sequences I have to check are not that high.
Yeah.
So eavesdropper can actually just do that brute force comparison with those if the length is known. Right?
Yeah,
Not
if the
so
length
many
is known.
sequences to
Yeah,
check.
if the length is known. Yeah. So basically, these are all expected from the system. Essentially, when the memory is small, it is mostly dominated by the key memory rather than the data memory. Because you, as we saw in the case of data memory equal to 0, you still need to store a key of size 1. So basically, we need to find the point where data memory actually starts dominating key memory, because in practical systems, it's not viable to use a system where data memory is kind of low and key memory is the main thing that you are utilizing in your cache. So based on this constraint, we basically say that we should be operating somewhere between these two regimes of M, which is the cache memory. So we go back and look at the regimes of M where we can actually operate. And this is the regime where the data memory kind of starts dominating the key memory. And the last regime that I have there is the point after which there is only one key in the system. So as you go along the secure rate trade-off, you start changing the number of keys that are present in the system. Like the shared content becomes different. So at this point, you hit a point where there is only one key across all users, which is what I showed in the 2-2 example. There was only one key. So you don't want to operate in such a system, because if one user leaves, then basically you have to rekey the entire system. You want to operate in some other regime where if one user leaves, you only rekey those keys which have that user's index in it. So it leads to a lot less practical constraints in that case. So basically for a 5-user example, I've just plotted the key memory and the data memory. So this is the point that was on the first limitation, that you want to operate right of this point. So in general, you can actually show that in this expression, if R is for a value of R, if R equal to 1, there is only one key in the system. If R equal to 2, there are 2 keys in the system. So the implication being that an eavesdropper actually can access all the keys in the system by accessing only R of these caches. So in the case of R equal to 1, just one cache. In the case of 2 keys in the system, any 2 caches can lead to this vulnerability. So from that perspective, basically the last regime there is the weakest, and this is the strongest. Now here, obviously, it's strongest because it has only, every user has an individual key and no shared keys. But the key memory dominates, so we don't want to operate. So this is kind of the regimes that you want to work with for a secure case where you have enough variability in the keys as well as the data dominating the keys. So far we have talked about centralized caching, where the server actually decides exactly what to place in the user's caches. Now, there is also a concept of decentralized caching. Now, decentralization is basically kind of based on the content cached by the users and not per se the delivery, in the sense that the server basically allows, in Madali's original scheme, the server will basically allow the user to cache m by n random bits from any file. In this case, in our secure scheme, we allow every user to cache m minus 1 by n minus 1 random bits from each file. And then after these random bits are cached, the server basically maps these bits. I will show what mapping it does. So the server basically maps these bits to the shared content between users and delivers content centrally. So basically the difference is the content delivery is still central, but the caching process is actually decentralized. So if we allow each user to cache m minus 1 by n minus 1 bits from each file, you can see that given k users, each user can cache any bit in a file with a probability of m minus 1 by n minus 1. This in turn leads to the fact that considering any s of these users, the expected number of bits cached at exactly s user and not cached at any of the other k minus s users is given by this. So basically what the central server is now doing is it is allowing users to randomly cache bits, and now it is, after the users have cached, it's basically looking at what everyone has cached and mapping it back into a file split. So what it does is it makes a split of f null, where it says that, okay, these are the bits that have not been cached by any user in the system. Similarly, it makes a split f1, f2, f3, where these are the bits that have been cached by user 1, user 2, and user 3, and not shared. And then again, those are the bits that have been cached by any 2 users and any 3 users, and so on and so forth. So basically, you consider all possible subsets of the number of size of the number of users in this case. So based on the storage and splitting, you can actually say that the size of each split approximately is equal to this, where this is the value of q that I talked about, and this tau is basically the size of each subset. So for every possible subset here, we can measure the size of the fragments that have been cached, and based on this, basically what we do is we place keys in the system, which are the size of each of these fragments, essentially. Now the shared content. So basically, if we want to service these sets of users, like with these sets of files, we want to place keys which are basically shared between any 2 or any 3 users, based on the subset we are looking at. So again, there are basically 2 to the k minus 1 keys in the system, and each user caches 2 to the k minus 1. For the NK3C example, you can see that these are the total number of keys that are generated. We don't need a k null, because k null in that case would correspond to the file fragment f123. That is basically something that is stored by all users, and you don't need a key for that, right? So k1 in this case will service the fragment 12. So in this case also, based on our achievable scheme, we can show that the data memory is approximately equal to m minus 1 by n minus 1 into n, and the key memory is that. And again, I would like to comment on the fact that these are all approximate analysis in some sense, because this is a decentralized caching scheme, and these analyses are slightly asymptotic. But in practice, you can actually just zero pad things of unequal size to, you're limited by the worst case in practice. So you can just zero pad. So
Is that the answer to her question as well?
Which one?
Zero padding. Zero padding is an answer to the question she asked about unequal sizes.
Yeah, so in that case, basically we are looking at centralized, right? So in the case we are looking at centralized, you can actually do better than zero padding. So zero padding is kind of your approach for a decentralized case where you don't know what content. So you basically land yourself in a situation where you need a zero padding. But in a centralized case, you can actually do better placement. Like you can probably show that you can do better placement by dividing files in such a way that you don't need a zero pad. And obviously, we are talking about large files here anyway, in general video files or something where the size of the file is pretty large. So splitting a file is actually practical. So you don't end up with half a bit or something. You generally end up with more than that. So again, this is a graphic that shows the decentralized caching scheme for n equal to k equal to 3. And we can see that there are like these many number of shared keys, k1 to k3, and these are the cache contents of each user, where these guys cache the keys that have their index in them. And for a request of ABC, again, we can see that this multicast transmission with, so the files that are shared by any two users, those are basically encoded with the key that has size 2 plus 1, that is 3, essentially K1, 2, 3. So this is kind of related to the number of multicast transmissions that you expect to send for each split. So for a subset of size 2 out of 3, you have to send only one multicast transmission. So you need only one key. In the case where we are looking at subsets of size 1, you actually need 3 multicast transmissions. So there you will have 3 keys, K1, 2, 2, 3, and 1, 3. And finally, for the case where you are sending splits which are not cached by any user, you will need to have a unique key for every user. So which is K1, K2, and K3. And using this content, using the transmitted information, you can decode all the files. And you can show that at a memory of 5 by 3, rate of 38 by 27 is achievable. So the more interesting way to look about it is essentially the trade-off. So you can see that compared to the centralized trade-off, we are losing out slightly due to the asymptotic analysis and due to the fact that decentralized caching is taking place. But this again is basically asymptotic. As the number of users and files increase, you can show that the cost is also very less for decentralized. So from a practical setting, you might want to do decentralized. And another advantage of decentralized is the scheme itself, the delivery scheme itself remains constant for any value of m. Because basically what is happening here is the delivery scheme that I showed, this will be the same delivery scheme for any value of m that you choose. But what will happen is the fragments of these files and the sizes will change. So that's what determines the rate. So every fragment now will be of different size. So the decentralized scheme in essence is basically just one scheme across all sizes of m. Whereas in the centralized case, you choose different schemes. You can also think of it as a combination of all the centralized schemes kind of, because you can see that you have this scheme which was for a particular value of m for the centralized case. You have this scheme again which was for another higher value of m. So that's one advantage of decentralized, but then the cost is also not that high, so you can actually end up using decentralized for practical purposes. So again, if you compare the decentralized secure and the centralized secure, you can see that it's almost exactly the same case as the centralized one, that you replace m by n by the m-1 and m-1 and you get the decentralized rate. And again, the conclusion is the same, that asymptotically these two rates are expected to be equal.
Is that -1 because of that memory constraint that you said? You will need at least one.
Yeah, you will need at least one. Yeah, that's the interpretation. You will need at least one key. So basically, the interpretation is kind of you will need some keys in the memory to be stored in the memory. So if you think of the same achievable rate, you are taking a hit in memory, or vice versa, for the same memory, you are taking a hit in the achievable rate. Sure.
What's the overhead of being centralized here?
Sorry?
What's the overhead of being centralized here?
Ah,
I mean, you in two schemes you have a centralized entity, right? And
yeah.
So what is the benefit of being decentralized?
The centralized, I didn't understand, what is the benefit of being decentralized or centralized? The benefit of being decentralized is the fact that you are allowing the users the liberty to cache anything they want to, rather than you are exactly telling the users exactly what to cache or you are sending.
What is the overhead of telling users to cache some data?
Overhead of the backhaul.
Yeah.
What will happen?
Because at two schemes you at the end you download the same.
Yeah, but
It's
there's no
among the-
backhaul in it. We are reducing the backhaul link.
So you're not communicating to the users before the fact that
Just I think it doesn't.
it saves you some control messaging, I would say, on the overhead.
I mean, yeah, but some sort of indexing, right? It's not a real data.
So you still, the central entity in this case still need to learn what was cached, right? So it's not completely decentralized in that sense.
Yeah, it's not completely decentralized in the sense of delivery, basically.
Yeah.
The delivery is still centralized. But what needs to be cached is kind of decentralized in that every user can asynchronously cache anything.
Sure.
And then at a given point of time. So I think it is to do with some practical issues as far as synchronicity is also concerned, because each user can cache anything, and then when actually the delivery is going to happen, at that point of time, the server can decide that, okay, these are the things that are common in the users and I can send this delivery. Whereas in the centralized case, you have a specific type of placement in place. So if an additional user comes in, you have to replace everything in the centralized scheme. So you have to redo the entire caching process. Suppose an additional user comes in. So then your file splits are different, then your caching mechanism is also different because you are at a different memory rate trade-off now because your n has increased, your k has increased. But in the decentralized case, all the base station needs to do is allow that user also to cache some amount of bits from each file, and then it can just map everything back. It can remap. So the remapping is done at the base station level. So you don't need recaching every time a new user comes in or every
But
time.
what if one user leaves? You can send that data from the central server itself, right? That will give you another trade-off. How many users should leave the system for a decentralized scheme to perform better than the centralized, right?
The decentralized, I would guess, the decentralized would never really perform better than the centralized, basically, because you are essentially doing exactly the same thing as the centralized, but you are just mapping the bits back, right? I mean, if you allow multiple users to leave,
Yes.
so in that case, the central server just kind of remaps everything. But in the centralized case, I would kind of,
No, in the centralized case, let's say a few users leave.
yeah, you send the additional data
Exactly. You
to
just send the additional data to make up for that.
yeah, but then supposing the fact that the memory size is constant, right? You need to send different type of data to those users, right? You need to send much more over the air, right? If the memory size is constant, it's not like just sending additional data. For a given memory size, you need to take it out and replace it with something else, right? Because it's totally based on the indexing. So now these sizes will all change in the centralized case. So the decentralized case is basically kind of immune to that sort of a scenario where users are leaving and entering a system.
Is the centralized expression a lower bound for this?
Centralized expression is a lower bound for this. Yes. So we have actually shown that. So in this case, so basically this is the lower bound that we have in our secure caching scheme with again a cut set argument. And if you compare the secure and insecure lower bounds, they also behave in a similar manner. That as the number of users and files increase, they are almost equal. So how am I doing on time? Am I?
Maybe like
10 minutes?
10 minutes.
Yeah, I think I'm almost done here. So basically, this talks about the kind of idea that is used to prove these lower bounds, both the centralized and both the secure and the non-secure. So what you do is you consider any S number of users. So you have a total set of users K, right? 1 to K. So you consider any S of these users, where S can vary from 1 to K for that matter. So what you do is you consider the demands of these S users. So suppose the demands of these S users is S unique files, right? You need to make one transmission X1 so that this transmission along with the caches of these S users can decode all of these files. So now we are talking about a lower bound, so we don't have any specification on the kind of achievable scheme that you need to design. This is something that you have to be able to do in order to make this caching system work. So you need this transmission and these files, these caches as side information to decode all the S possible files. Again, if you consider another set of requests from these same S users, that D1 to DS is now a different set of unique files, S plus 1 to 2S. This set of unique files with the transmission, this set of requests with the transmission X2 and the same caches will enable you to decode S plus 1 to 2S number of files. Now, all this is considering that 2S is less than N. So if you consider n by s floor of this thing, such number of requests, so this should enable you to, with these transmissions and the S caches, this should enable you to decode 1 to S NS kind of unique files. So the case where that S is 1, that is basically the case where you decode all files or you decode all the files in that case. So now, in addition to this, we have two conditions, two information theoretic conditions for the transmissions. That is, one is file decodability. That is the case that given these X1 to XNS transmissions and the first S caches, you need to be able to decode all these SNS files, right? So basically, the entropy of these files, given the transmissions in the caches, has to be almost zero, or has to be zero for that matter. We consider it 7 here. And then there's a security constraint that in our case kicks in. So this is not present in Madali's original case. This is the additional constraint that we have, that all the files, given any one of the transmissions, given any one of these transmissions, the mutual information between the library of files and the transmissions has to be 0, which is the security constraint. So basically what we consider in this case is an information flow consisting of the transmissions x1 to xSNS or floor ns, those many transmissions, the caches as side information for decoding all these files. And we use a cut set kind of argument. So the first equation in that series would be the fact that the number of files that is decoded is basically less than equal to the entropy of the joint entropy of all the files. And now if you continue this and incorporate our security and file decodability constraints, you can actually end up proving this. I'm not going through the steps here, but you can actually end up proving this expression, which if you take a limit of epsilon tends to 0, you end up with our bound. So without the security constraint, you end up with a bound which just does this without the minus ones, essentially. So in our case also, we are able to prove the order optimality of these security schemes. So basically, if you consider the centralized scheme, the RCS and the R star S that we have proved, R star S is basically the lower bound on the optimal rate. So we can show that the centralized secure scheme is basically within a constant multiplicative gap from the optimal. And the same holds true for the decentralized case. And if you use these two together, you end up with the fact that the decentralized and the centralized are also, like you were saying, it's a lower bound or it's a constant gap relation. Obviously, now these numbers are basically coming out of some involved numerical proofs. So in practice, these numbers are generally much lesser. Even in Madali's case, he proved a gap of 12, but you can see that the actual number is closer to 5. So in our case, if you plot the maximum gap across files and users for each of these systems, you can see that it generally never exceeds 6 for practical purposes. So I guess that's all I had for today. We kind of showed that we can achieve secure delivery with sharing of keys across users for both a centralized and decentralized case, and both of these are kind of order optimal as far as the lower bound is concerned. And again, the key storage in this case is centralized because the delivery process is always centralized, but the caching process itself can be both centralized and decentralized. And again, as the number of users and files increase, the cost of security is negligible in terms of rate. And the order optimality result as well. So that's all I have for today.
Is that 6 number that you showed like the overhead involved? What you asked? Would that answer this question?
No, I don't think it's related to overhead as such. It's basically kind of showing that this is the best you can. So if you have a lower bound which does not have any assumptions on achievability, with the scheme that we are providing, we are actually within a constant gap from that achievability. That's all it's showing basically. That it's kind of approximate.
The last inequality you had was centralized and decentralized comparison, right?
Yeah.
So
this
that's
is
what you plotted in the next case.
no. So this is the thing for centralized. So the lower bound, the gap between the lower bound and the upper bound on the centralized. So a similar plot you can achieve for the decentralized as well. So for centralized and decentralized, obviously we are just naively using these two theorems and getting this value. In general, it's much lower. It's even lower than 6 or 5. It will be expected to be around 2 or 3.
So is 5 or 6 small? Because this rate is actually spectral efficiency, right?
Yeah, this rate is spectral efficiency.
So a gap, multiplicative gap of 5 is actually non-negligible for spectral efficiency.
Yes. So now that leads us to the second question: that is it the achievable scheme that is bad or the lower bound is loose?
Sure.
So we are basically working on this problem itself, and a lot of recent work has shown that the lower bound is actually loose. So it's enough to prove the order optimality of the achievable scheme up to a constant multiplicative gap, but you can keep improving this gap. And it has been shown for small cases that some of the achievable points are actually optimal. So in that case, it's always the best thing to do. And we are also working on some of these issues. So mostly it has been kind of the idea that the lower bound itself is. So Badali himself says in his paper that the lower bound is loose. The cut set based argument is loose. It does not capture the. So in the lower bound, basically we are kind of talking about no assumptions on the achievable scheme, right? So you need to capture all possible kind of interactions between caches. So that is not basically done by the cut set argument.
So purpose was order optimality, so that is.
Yeah, the purpose of the lower bound exercise is order optimality, and you already have an achievable scheme which is kind of doing much better than your traditional unicast security or non-secure, both schemes. Yeah.
And this scheme be used in the real scenario where the devices change, the join system and leave system.
Yeah. So
Does that mean that each time when there's someone leave or join, you have to reassign?
yeah, you have to reassign keys. But then in the decentralized case or in the shared key scenario, you have to reassign only those keys which have that user's index.
Do you think of this frequency of the join, if it's too frequent, that deserves to reassign everything?
Yeah, I mean, again, that brings us to the original question of how often you cache and deliver in real network. So it's about the fact that if you consider, yeah, we haven't considered that problem in our real scenario because you don't want to think about caching and delivery as a scenario where users are constantly leaving and joining. So in general, it's more of a stable system where you have a set of users and you can kind of exploit the temporal nature of the traffic over a period of a day maybe.
Any more questions? You have any questions? Our caching expert.
I asked my question now. To add to what you asked, right, about multiplicative gap, I think what would be nice to get an additive gap. Yeah, sure. But yeah, multiplicative gap, as you said, that in simulations we observe it's like 4.55, something like that. And so to add to what he said, that both lower bound and the achievability, actually both are loose.
Yeah.
So it's not just the lower bound is loose, but the achievability is also loose. And we don't know, you know.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's kind of unknown at this point, but which is
Even
kind
for
of,
like the simplest toy example of 3 users and 3 caches, we don't know the optimal region. There have been recent works by Chao Tian, and he has this interesting tool which uses a computer-aided approach to look at all possible inequalities. So in some sense, you can pose a problem, like from these transmissions and these caches, I should be able to decode these set of files. So there are exponentially many constraints, right? So ideally, one would like to exploit all these constraints, look at the join behavior, and then say that among all possible schemes, under these constraints, the rate must be lower bounded by this much. Right? But manually doing it, understanding which constraint is active, which is not, that becomes a very difficult problem. So he has a computer-aided approach, which somehow spits out the right constraints to be considered.
yeah,
So he has improved upon the toy example of 3 users and 3 caches. Apparently, he has the best bound for that toy example. We have something which holds for any number of users, any number of caches. So we also grew upon the cut set bound, but for 3 users, 3 caches, his bound is apparently the best so far.
and I mean, from his example, he identifies some 56 inequalities,
Yeah.
which he kind of uses to solve solve the lower bound. And I guess we are working with 3 or 4.
Optimality is in itself, it's not really a trivial task, right? I mean,
Yeah.
So the next step is always hard, going from order popularity to actually.
All right.
Okay.
We'll sign this video again.